Hello, I'm Jennifer Firestein, Associate State Director for AARP Michigan, and welcome to Learn a Latte. This is our Wednesday morning speaker series where you can enjoy a cup of coffee, get great information from our speakers, and, well, learn a latte. We host this live event on Facebook the first and third Wednesdays of each month at 10 a.m. And the benefit to watching live is that you can ask your questions and then hear from the speakers. So if you have any questions or comments, post them in the comments section. This is being recorded, so you can rewatch it at aarp.org/mi. Today, our topic is building bridges between generations. The benefits to developing intergenerational relationships are immense, and bridging the gap between generations dispels the stereotypes of older adults. And the good news for you is that it can lower depression, improve quality of life, and allows both generations to learn from and mentor each other. Our guest speaker is Dr. Heather Wallace. She's a gerontologist and assistant professor of public health at Grand Valley State University. She received her PhD in gerontology from the University of Kentucky and completed a National Cancer Institute predoctoral fellowship in rural cancer control and prevention. She's conducted qualitative research examining the role of spirituality in treatment decision-making among rural head and neck cancer patients. Her research interests include exploring the role of spiritual aspects of 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, as well as how intergenerational relationships and contemplative practices can be used to enhance spirituality, well-being, and health among patients, providers, and those students training to work in healthcare. She's developed and taught academic and public classes and events related to spirituality in late life, vulnerable populations, health disparity, aging, and medical ethics. So welcome, Heather.
Good morning, Jennifer. Thank you.
So before we even get started with the conversation, can you explain what the difference is between the terms multi-generational and intergenerational? We hear them used, and I'm just curious too, if they can be used interchanged or if they mean different things.
Yeah, so I think if we focus on the root of those words, it kind of tells us a lot about what they mean. So intergenerational is inside of, right? So intergenerational relationships are those relationships that are a little bit more narrow and focused and are between a single person and another person or multiple people that are of different generations. So an intergenerational relationship, an example of that could be a mother and a child, a mother and a grandmother, or your next door neighbor who's 2 or 3 generations older than you, and that just that friendly neighbor relationship that you might have. So it's intergenerational, it's in between, it's between one person and another. So multi-generational is a term that we use more broadly speaking, and it has to do with multiple people who are of different ages or different generations, to be more specific. So if we're talking about diversity, right, we might say that there is a diverse group of people at a church or in a social organization or even at an event. But if we're really trying to cue into differences in terms of age, we might say that it's multi-generational. So if there's a playground, for example, that also has maybe a walkway that has exercise stations for adults, and they have benches with armrests that might be more attractive to someone who isn't interested in walking a half a mile without resting, right? We could say that it's a multi-generational space, in that multiple generations of people could use that space, but in different ways.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying that.
Sure. So I'm very happy to be here today. I wanted to, as kind of you mentioned in the beginning there, to talk about some of the benefits that we have to developing intergenerational relationships. So these relationships often exist for us in kind of a natural way, and that is, as I said before, kind of through our families and through our close friends and social networks, maybe through church or our work, our neighborhoods, where we're interacting and we have a relationship with someone who's younger or older than us by 20 to 30 years, let's say. So these are relationships that we kind of, I think sometimes, for lack of a better word, take for granted. We know that we have those people in our life. So I wanted to talk today about trying to be a little bit more intentional about establishing new relationships that are intergenerational, and what those might look like and why. So some of the benefits of those relationships are very profound, or have the potential to be profound in our life. And those are some of the things that you already mentioned, like aspects of physical wellness, getting people out of their homes or to step kind of outside of their comfort zone to interact in different ways. So the research and even history, right, tells us that people who have intergenerational relationships, beyond just regular relationships, because those are very valuable too, but when they're more diverse in terms of having people ahead of us in our lives, like our older adults, people who are where we are in our own life, and people that are behind us, having that kind of continuity between generations can have a lot of benefits. So I mentioned the physical already, just getting people out of their homes and even within their homes, but doing different activities. Having emotional support, there's benefits to knowing that there's people who've gone before us, right? And we can kind of walk in their shoes and learn from them and learn how to cope and to manage and to build some of that resiliency that we see is so important these days. Also, spiritual connection. So finding meaning and purpose in your life. And those intergenerational relationships can be very valuable in that regard too. So there's mental, occupational, and societal benefits, not just for individuals, but for groups of people, for families, for whole communities, to have those connections that are before and behind them, those people that are older than us as well as younger than us. So those benefits are relatively easy to reap, although we don't necessarily recognize them all the time as they come along.
So of those characteristics, the physical, the emotional, spiritual, physical, all of those aspects to intergenerational benefits, what do you think is the most important, or what is maybe most important, but then also maybe most overlooked?
Well, this is my personal bias, but I think there's many ways for us as we get older, whatever stage of life we're in, but also in older life, to engage physically, right? We can walk to the end of our driveway and back. We can connect with an old friend for that emotional well-being. So I think those are more at our fingertips. And the one that I think is most overlooked and has a really significant impact on our well-being and even our physical health is that of spiritual health. So we might not make the connection between spiritual health and spirituality and intergenerational relationships, but I think this is a place where, because spirituality in a secular sense, because religion is one way to get there, but there are many other ways to get to enhance our spiritual wealth and our health and wellness. And one of those ways is to have that meaning, right? That significance, to be able to tell your story. And we know that the research tells us that that's important as well. that we are able to connect with a person in a way that gives us some kind of sense of being able to contribute. So to have someone that's perhaps younger in our life that we can contribute something to, as well as that taking from someone else, learning from someone older than yourself, even sharing stories and that personal connection that, wow, I'm really scared of, breast cancer. It runs in my family, and that's terrifying to me. So to learn from someone older than me that maybe survived breast cancer 30 years ago, right? And what that experience of their breast cancer was like. That's why support groups are so useful, right? So these kinds of relationships can help us nurture that meaning and purpose and significance in our life in really profound ways. So I think it's an often overlooked piece of our health. And I'll just throw in there that as we age, physical health, mental health, many different facets of our health tend to decline. And for some of us more rapidly than others, right? So spiritual health is the only characteristic of health or aspect of health that actually has the profound potential to grow as we go through our life. So it's a wonderful way to use an intergenerational relationship to help build that and to nurture that piece of ourselves.
And with the spiritual aspect, that's really about creating that meaning, the purpose, correct?
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think there is some confusion. We often think spirituality is religion, and maybe you think, well, I'm not a religious person, so that's not accessible to me. But it's also can be true that you might be a very religious person and you have a church community and you have your religious practices that you observe regularly. And maybe you feel that you have a relationship there, but you might not feel spiritual. You might not feel that your spiritual health is very robust. So that spirituality, as you just pointed out, is an aspect of ourselves that helps us feel connected to something bigger than ourselves. And for some people, that's God or an institutional sense of religion, but it can be something different for some of us as well. Regardless of what it is, we know that it's really important to our health, particularly as we grow old.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in there the occupational well-being, that personal satisfaction. So what is the personal satisfaction that people get from these intergenerational relationships?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. And if we look at it's tricky because it's hard to answer, right? It's kind of like saying, why does hope give people some kind of power to persist, right? Like, I have hope, I'm going to make it, right? So it's very similar to that. So spirituality is kind of this grit, if you will, that helps us feel like there's something bigger than ourselves. And as human beings, it's part of universally, regardless of if you were alive 2,000 years ago or probably 2,000 years from now and everything in between, it's this aspect of being human, this longing for understanding what our life means, for understanding purpose, for a feeling of being grateful. That's also something we know universally among human beings, is that people do better emotionally, psychologically, when they feel that they are contributing something and that it's valuable. So having intergenerational relationships can be that. It can give us opportunities to, even if it's just a few seconds, right? Like, I taught this person how to do something. I heard a story. I listened to that. I take it in. So whatever those activities might be. And you mentioned, occupationally, occupation doesn't have to be a job that you get paid for doing, but it's the things that occupy our time. So if you're sitting at home watching, Days of Our Lives, I have fond memories of my grandmother doing that. She'd spend hours watching soap operas. Not that occupationally stimulating, right? Whereas when myself and my nephew or her nephew were at her house and her other grandchildren, she's occupying her time doing something. She might be teaching us how to bake cookies. She might be taking us for a walk through the woods. And even those kinds of things can be very satisfying emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically.
So I think we maybe take for granted that intergenerational relationship that we have maybe with our grandparents.
Mhm.
Is there a difference in, the benefits of it if it's like a non-family member, or is it just the same? Or is there just something, a different aspect when you're developing a relationship with somebody who's not a family member? It might be a mentor or,
Mhm.
a big brother in the Big Brothers program, whatever it might be.
Sure. So, of course, there's going to be different ways that we interact with people, even subconsciously or unconsciously, when it's a family member, right? There's things that I would do in my parents' home or my grandparents' home, and things that I would say and do that I wouldn't necessarily do with even a very, very close friend or dear friend that's maybe the same age as my parents or grandparents if I was in their home. So, the benefit is the same, right? It's still in a doorway towards these things like spiritual, satisfaction and emotional occupation, and all of these things are still accessible, whether it's a family member or someone who is a new relationship, someone that you've just started and are pursuing an intentional relationship with in terms of trying to have this intergenerational relationship. But I think sometimes we need to stop and think about how we engage in these activities, how we engage with an older adult. And I wanted to share a little bit of that too, because we often, I think the first step is to identify for ourselves what our stereotypes are. And I know from experience in working with younger and older adults and bringing them together in the classroom that we often hold some stereotypical ageist ideas, both older adults themselves and younger people as well, right? So what are those? I've heard older adults often say, "Oh, I don't have anything to teach anybody," or "Nobody wants to hear my stories," or "My life wasn't that interesting." Well, it might be. It probably is to someone else. In and of itself, it's valuable. So to recognize those stereotypes that we have about ourselves as an older person or older people, to respect those differences, I think is really important. And I think this is another benefit of intergenerational relationships, is that it can be a place where um, civility, if you will, being civil to one another when we do have differences. It's a place to find a common ground and to just say, yeah, we're different. I have different views. I have different opinions, but it's okay. What can we learn from each other without having to change anyone's mind about something, right? Um,
You talked about the stereotypes, and it really can go both ways. That
Absolutely.
people, older adults, can stereotype against millennials, right? We've heard, negative things about millennials, and then millennials can stereotype against older adults.
Right. Yep.
AARP actually created a video, and we'll put the link in the comment section. And it's a really interesting video where they brought together millennials and older adults to teach each other things. And they come onto the screen and they're thinking, I've got nothing to learn, I've got nothing to teach, and they walk away and they're like, wow, like that was really interesting. That both the pairings, the older adult and the millennial, walked away like with a new appreciation for the other person. So
yeah, that's a great example of what this nugget, this golden nugget of intergenerational relationships is, because in just a few minutes, right? And whether it's a long-term, really deep personal relationship, or even just a touch-in, right? Like you went to the park and you sat on the bench and you talked, the 80-year-old great-grandmother spends 20 minutes talking to the new 25-year-old mom, and just how different parenting and even childbirth, right? And raising children can be. But to have that connection, right? To tell that story, to offer something that might be useful. So I think one way to think about intergenerational relationships from both sides is as a mentor, right? And oftentimes, unfortunately, we think of like, okay, I want to intentionally build an intergenerational relationship. I want to have this relationship with someone younger than me, perhaps. Or older than me. And people say, when it's often going the other way, a younger person working with an older adult, we want to teach them something. Like, let's take a group of 20-year-olds and have them teach a group of 70-year-olds how to use some new app or computer like Zoom, right? Let's teach them how to do that. So it's very kind of one-sided that way. It's these younger people assuming they have something to kind of bring on board to this older population. So if we flip that thinking and we think for both sides here about mentorship. So what is mentorship and who can be a mentor? And I've shared this quote here that wherever there are beginners and experts, right? The young and the old, there's some kind of teaching going on. And that's really what intergenerational relationships are all about. Is how can we teach each other something, even in the most of informal ways, right? So surely we can establish like a book club or a knitting group where younger people are learning how to knit from older people, or younger people are teaching older people how to use a digital camera or something like that. But even when we wash away kind of those formalities and that structure, there's still something very valuable, something very potent about just being with people who are younger and older than yourself and seeing the world through their eyes, right, as they have lived it. It can be very enlightening, if you will, to understand, like, wow, I never thought of it this way, or wow, that's such an amazing experience that you've walked through. What can I learn from that? So, yeah.
So we have a question from Christine, and she's asking, what if people just don't seem to like you and you don't know why? So if you have maybe a conflict in that mentorship dynamic.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of people. So I wouldn't let that question could be a real stumbling block. If you perceive that someone doesn't like you as a person, right, then maybe we move on to another person. And that might seem like the easy out, right? But we are who we are, and we're not here to try and change ourselves, but to offer to someone who's receptive to who we are. So how can we move past that? The other piece of that question is that there are hopefully people in your life that you can trust, that have a relationship with you, that can kind of hold up a mirror for you and to ask them that question. And this isn't all that off from what a question I've asked myself. So I moved to West Michigan from Alberta, Canada, and I've been here 10 years. And about 3 years ago, I had my son, and I looked around and I realized, like, oh my gosh, I don't have any friends. Like, how can I live someplace for 7 years and not have any friends? Like, people must not like me. Like, what's wrong with me? Right? And I was very intentional about it. I'd go to mom groups, I'd go to book clubs, and my phone wasn't ringing asking me to come over and have coffee. So I thought, like, what is it about me? But I think the other piece of that is, it's probably not you personally. It might be this ageist stereotype that dominates our culture. And that is that, old people are boring. They're whatever, if coming from a younger perspective, right? Like, and we self-segregate in our culture as well, right? So we have different groups, like, you go to an event and you don't see multi-generational audiences. You see a fairly narrow one. So I think part of it is finding the group where there's a space for that, just to really engage with other people and see what you think of each other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Pauline is asking, she said, I'm hearing older people need to find a common ground to connect with younger generations. Is that correct?
I would say that's one way to look at it. It certainly is maybe a safer or more comfortable experience to find a space where there are younger people who are kind of open to being around and with and engaging with older adults. But I think part of it is just, a benefit of intergenerational relationships is it's a benefit, but it also takes work, right? Because there are these stereotypes. There is ageism that gets in the way. And so trying to find or navigate your way into a relationship or interacting with groups that are older or younger than ourselves can be kind of challenging. But there's some ways to do that. And we can talk about that in a few minutes if you'd like.
Yeah. So what are those ways? What are some like great stories or ways that you've seen, to bridge that gap, to bring older and younger generations together?
Yeah. So, again, we don't, as I said, it's kind of hard to find our way. And so some of these might feel a little generic, but that oftentimes people will have particularly here in West Michigan, and I know people are watching from perhaps outside of West Michigan, but our local church groups and civic groups. So joining a gym, or joining some people roll their eyes when I say this, but a senior citizen center, right? And look for those programs and opportunities within those organizations and others, right? It could be going to the library. Libraries often have lots of different programs, or looking at your local AARP listings of different types of activities and finding a niche, right? Where can I go where there might be other people who might have something in common with me? Like perhaps they like to cook, but we've got 20-year-olds cooking, and we've got me cooking who's 70 or 80 or 50 or however old. To look for those ways that you can make those connections, and then start trying to introduce some conversation. So again, sometimes it can take some work, right? You've got to be willing to kind of step outside. You've got to be willing for people to say, I'm not interested, right? And then you start over. But if there are older or younger adults in your life, and younger people in your life that you already know, maybe a neighbor, maybe an old acquaintance, doing things like watching a movie together. Watch a movie that has something to do with aging, and just talk about it. So I watched, last week, I watched a movie on Netflix or Amazon called Palms, about a woman who has cancer, who moves to a senior citizen kind of neighborhood. And she starts a cheerleading squad, right? And so watching that, like talking about that with my mom, we both had very different perspectives about what was going on in that movie. So it's intentional, but it gets conversations started.
Right. And we had that movie as a Movies for Grown-Ups with AARP. And it is a great movie with that intergenerational element, because one of the younger girls who's a cheerleader kind of steps in and provides choreography and develops the relationship with the older adults. And it can be difficult to find those opportunities. And to our viewers that are in Grand Rapids or in West Michigan, AARP and Grand Valley State University partnered to develop a new program called Grand Connections. And it's an opportunity to do exactly what we're talking about, bridge the gap. And so older adults and college students from GVSU are paired up based on interests and what they want to get out of the program. And maybe they have something they want to do, where it might be like they want to learn how to do photography together, or it might just be, meeting for a cup of coffee and having conversation and dialogue. So if you're interested and you're in the West Michigan area and you're interested in joining the Grand Connections program, or at least getting information, we have the link provided in the comment section. So click on the link and you'll get directed to GVSU, and they will reach out to you. And then it's just an opportunity to develop those intergenerational relationships. So we're really excited about the program, because we've had this conversation with GVSU and Dr. Wallace many times, as far as how do we bridge the gap, and how can AARP and GVSU work together to do this. So Grand Connections is the launch of this. So we're very excited about it and think that there's just a lot of great potential. And to break down those stereotypes and to give people the opportunity to come together. So Heather, just one last question.
Sure.
How much research has been done around this, as far as the benefits and the importance of it? This is your life, your academia, but how much research has been done?
Yeah. So there's volumes and volumes of research. We've known this for many, many, many years, for decades, that intergenerational relationships are important. And it's only been relatively recently in human history that these intergenerational relationships have started to erode, which is really scary, because for most of human history, families lived in intergenerational connectedness within their homes and within their immediate communities. And now, we have younger people increasingly who don't have those relationships in their life, and older adults who don't have younger people in their life. The challenge has been that despite the immense amount of research that has been done over many years, that all says that this is important to human well-being, whatever age you might be, It's hard to do in our culture because, as I said, we segregate, right, by age and by various other factors. So it takes work. We have to get out of our comfort zone, be willing to be said, have somebody say, I'm not interested in you, right? And hopefully that doesn't happen often, but through things like Grand Connections and if you're not within the West Michigan area, universities are fairly well known for being good places for older adults because they offer so many cultural and civic experiences. They're kind of a natural playground, if you will, for people to interact and to come together. And many retirement places geographically in the United States are very near large campuses like Indiana University in Bloomington in Indiana, for example. So look, I encourage you all to really kind of look around and think about what you have to offer, because I promise you have something, and probably much more than you ever dreamed. There's so much to gain from learning and being with other people as well, whether it's older or younger, right? So if you're 70, you can always look to someone who's 90, right? It doesn't have to be somebody who's 20 or 30. So look for ways to do that. And we would love to have you at Grand Connections. And we'd love to hear your ideas about how that might look in the future going forward.
And just the best example that you can give of a connection that has really resulted, do you have a good anecdotal story?
One story that comes to mind, I pair my college students who are in their 20s with older adults over the age of 80 for a class on health and spirituality. And I had a student who, it was about halfway through the semester, they had gotten to know each other really well. And this student was a nursing student, and her older adult that she was with had cancer 7 different times over their lifetime, from their 20s all the way through to having had their last experience fairly recently, with different types of cancers. And we did an activity where we drew our life metaphorically as a river, with boulders that are challenges that don't move or you can't really change. And then there's, logs that are things you can change about your life, and so on and so forth. And so they each drew their picture, and then they trade, right? And the older adult had some pebbles in her river, no real big boulders. And the student said, like, I don't understand. Like, why didn't you put all your cancer experiences in your river? Like, those were big things in your life. And the older adult laughed and said, like, oh no, those are the pebbles. And it was just such a profound learning moment for the student that, like, for her as a 20-some-year-old nursing student, this seemed catastrophic, right? And from the older adult's perspective, looking back on 50 years of having lived through cancer multiple times, she was able to talk about how she'd grown from it and how transformative it was for her and how difficult and scary it was, but how she had overcome it. So that was a really, I think, powerful moment for both of them to learn that there was something to learn bigger from that experience of the older adult, and that the student took with them into their education and future as a nurse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really neat. And I just recently started mentoring a young mom. Our paths crossed years ago, and then they crossed again just recently. And it's really developing into a rich relationship, where it's like I was stepping into it to help her, and I feel like she's giving me just as much in return, because of the fact that I'm learning from her, and we're sharing a friendship. And so I think that it's a great opportunity to give back to others, but I think the reward that you receive is equally great.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right on.
Well, Heather, and I should say Dr. Wallace, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming on and just sharing your expertise in this area. I know how passionate you are about it because of endless conversations that we've had in working together on the Grand Connections program. So I want to thank you for working in this area and being our speaker today. We have a host of other virtual events that we offer. And if you want to tap into everything that we're doing, like drum circles and movies for grownups and other Learn a Latte events, we encourage you to go to aarp.org/MI. And you can check out all of the virtual events that we have coming up. And you can also go back and watch all of the events that we've done. So like this one, if you want to share it with others, you can, or if you want to rewatch it, if you missed any part of it, you can go back and watch it. by going to aarp.org/MI. So thank you, Dr. Wallace, and
My
thank you
pleasure.
for viewers.
Great. Thank you.